But despite all the talk about equality, the Russian masses did have a conductor who directed everything, and it was Lenin. By the time he died, he had created a one-party, one-ideology state and an elaborate system of control. But under Lenin, the aim of socialism had not yet been achieved. His successor, Joseph Stalin, inherited a society in which large parts of the old Russia survived. Peasants were still able to sell the produce they farmed themselves in the markets. Stalin was determined to complete the building of socialism. So he launched the first 5-year plan to modernize the economy. It was a call for mobilization to create the heavy industries the Soviet Union needed to defend itself in a hostile world. Construction worker Tatiana Fyodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch-bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
With so much to build so quickly, workers were sent all over the country to fulfill the plan. Tens of thousands went beyond the Ural Mountains to start construction of a giant new steelworks. They saw themselves as pioneers. For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Arkhipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве домен был один эскаватор, и то плохой. И мы...
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't always reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand. The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5 or 6 levels. That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
Magnitogorsk was modeled on a plant in America. Among the workers were thousands of forced laborers, and all lived in terrible conditions.
The beds were in one large room, shared by up to 200 people, often whole families together. There were wooden lavatories outside and a communal kitchen. Water was rationed, and we had to get that outside as well. I think that we, the first construction workers of Magnitogorsk, were united by the difficulties we all faced. We were already schooled in our Soviet traditions. We felt the whole economy was ours, that we were the bosses, that we were working for ourselves.
The burst of construction and spending in the Soviet Union came at the time of the Great Depression in the West. Many of the jobless liked what they heard about communism. It sounded like a worker's paradise.
I became a communist in short because of what I saw around me here in the United States of America. There was misery, there were children going to bed hungry, there was poverty, and there was no reason for it. We were the richest country in the world, and I saw communists out on the streets demonstrating and trying to do something about it. And that would sum up why I joined the Communist Party. Well, I believe what was going on in the Soviet Union was a noble experiment. You stop and think for a moment of what is the aim of socialism. It's to end all exploitation. It's to put an end to wars. It's to build a system of cooperation instead of confrontation. It's to do away with the extremely rich on one side and the extremely poor on the other side.
The Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw toured the Soviet Union, visiting factories and farms with Lady Astor. Shaw wrote in a hotel visitor's book, "Tomorrow I leave this land of hope and return to our Western countries of despair." When he got back, he claimed Russia had been maligned.
We have rebuked her ungodliness, and now the sun shines on Russia as on a country with which God is well pleased, whilst his wrath is heavy on us, and we don't know where to turn for comfort or approval.
Soviet newsreels showed Stalin as a genial figure, head of the family of nationalities who made up the new workers' state. But he was ruthless with anyone who challenged him. He demanded cooperation at all levels. For millions of Russians, the church was still a source of strength and offered the only alternative system of beliefs. The communists saw the church as a challenge and intensified their attacks on it. Village priests were ridiculed and harassed and forced to renounce their faith. Israel Chernitsky was a communist activist in his village in the Ukraine.
Пришел батюшка, снял себя рясу, да, и положил на стул.
The priest came in, took off his cassock and put it on the table. They called the barber, and he cut off his hair. And the priest announced, "There is no God. I've lied to you." The peasant sitting there cried out, "How could you? We built you a house, and now you're saying there's no God."
The greatest threat to the life of the peasants came when Stalin decided to end private farming. He thought their methods were too inefficient to raise the food the country now needed. A campaign was organized against the richer peasants, the so-called kulaks, who were said to be opposing Stalin's plans. Kulak farmers were rounded up.
Зашли мы в дом, комиссия, человек 5-6, я уже не помню. И секретарь партизации.
We went into the house, the commission of 5 or 6 people, and the secretary of the party organization announced, "According to the decision of our meeting, your family is de-kulakized. Put all your valuables on the table. I warn you, no hysterics, I've got strong nerves, we'll stand firm." A woman burst into tears and cursed the authorities.
Stalin said the kulaks should be liquidated as a class. Over 3 million were shot or died in exile or the camps. The state seized the farm implements of all the peasants. They took over all the land, which was now to be farmed collectively in large units. But the peasants didn't want collectivization. They killed their livestock rather than give them up, and the state took the grain. The result was famine. Over 5 years, 7 million died of starvation. These were scenes that Bernard Shaw and other Western visitors did not see. Pelagia Ovcharenko was almost taken by the body collectors.
3 people came to the house. 1 tended the horses. 2 were piling up corpses on the cart. They threw on my mother. They threw on my father. My father gestured to me. The man said, "He's almost ready, he's almost dead." When my father gestured, I knew I had to go and hide. The men swore. They couldn't find me because I'd crawled away on my hands and knees and hidden myself. Corpses were piled up like bales of straw. The men took the cart to a big hole and tipped the bodies in, regardless of whether they were dead or alive.
The price was not mentioned when Stalin listed socialism's achievements in 1937.
На наших фабриках и заводах работают без капиталистов. Работают труженики фабрик и заводов. Руководят фабриками и заводами люди из народа. Это и называется у нас социализмом на деле. На наших полях работают труженики земли, без помещиков, без кулаков. Руководят этими работами люди из народа. Это и называется у нас социализмом в быту.
It was said Stalin's ovations were so long because nobody dared to be seen as the first to stop clapping. For Stalin was not just using harsh methods to push through changes he thought were essential. He was obsessed with destroying all potential opponents. The leader of the first workers' state lived in reclusive comfort. He felt insecure even about those closest to him. One by one, the most senior communists who had planned the political and social transformation of the country became his victims. Nikolai Bukharin had helped Stalin to power, but then dared to criticize him. At first, Bukharin was isolated in his Kremlin flat with his young wife. He remained a loyal communist even when the moment of arrest came.
It was terrifying, tragic. He literally fell down on his knees before me and asked forgiveness for ruining my life. He said that if he could ever have imagined that his life would end this way, he would have run as far as possible away from me. No matter how strong his love, he would have suppressed it. He asked me never to forget his letter, which is now called his testament, and without fail to bring up his son a Bolshevik. That's the kind of faith he had, a Bolshevik to the end.
Суд идет, прошу встать.
Садитесь, пожалуйста.
Bukharin's fate was sealed at one of a series of show trials specially designed as propaganda events to create fear and instill obedience. The trials were a concoction of fake evidence and false accusations. Confessions were forced through torture and threats to the victims' families. Officials and journalists in the courtroom played their part in the same drama. Boris Yefimov, who attended Bukharin's trial as a newspaper cartoonist, says he believed the confession he heard was genuine.
How could I doubt it if with my own ears I heard Bukharin describe himself as an enemy? How he had planned to overthrow Soviet power, to hand over the Ukraine to the Germans. How he told of his betrayal.
Свергнуть советскую власть, отдать Украину немцам, Приморье японцам, рассказывал про свою измену.
What would you have said in my place if you'd heard a man confess his crimes with your own ears?
Если вы своими ушами слышали, как человек признается в своих...
It was a kind of hypnosis.
Это был какой-то, так сказать, гипноз.
Вся наша страна от малого до старого ждет и требует одного – изменников и шпионов, продавших врагу нашу родину, расстрелять как поганых псов.
In his cartoons for Pravda, Yefimov obediently took up the prosecutor's description of the accused as vile dogs.
Это была у него какая-то фраза о том, что вот Trotsky и Bukharin это вот...
He'd used this phrase that Trotsky and Bukharin were one creature, a two-headed creature, the mad dog of fascism.
Две головы, но они, в общем, это одно и то же. Это...
It's an example of satire serving propaganda.
Фашизма. Вот это пример...
Every simple, I won't say fool, but every simple person could understand it.
Я не скажу дураку, но каждому простому человеку это понятно.
Yefimov applauded when the death penalty was pronounced.
When they read out his death sentence, something snapped inside me. I felt that I'd changed, that the lights over our wonderful Soviet Union were extinguished.
Я изменилась, померк и весь наш прекрасный Советский Союз.
Stalin's morbid paranoia grew. Nobody at any level of life in the country, regardless of whether they were in the party or not, was safe. From his desk, the Great Terror was controlled and conducted. Secret police orders gave every region an arbitrary quota for the purges. Category 1 meant death. Category 2 meant the prison camps. But at times Stalin grew impatient. When he scribbled, "Give a supplementary quota of 6,000 people in the first category to Krasnodar," he was signing the death warrant for an extra 6,000 on top of the previous target. The purges struck many of the earliest enthusiasts for communism. Mikhail Minlin, in Category 2, was arrested and interrogated by the secret police in Moscow.
When the interrogation began, I was asked to sign lies about myself and good comrades from my region. They handed me a list of 47 people. They wanted to get me to sign a statement. I wouldn't. They kept me standing for 5 days. Day and night. My legs were so swollen.
At the height of the purges, ordinary people were required to take part in mass demonstrations against enemies of the people. Yet some, who'd been most devoted to Stalin, were still blind to what was going on. Ella Shistya, the young electrical engineer, couldn't believe what her husband, a party official, told her.
He understood. He knew what I didn't know. When he said, "You can't imagine it, Stalin is shooting all the present members of the Politburo," and he counted them off one by one. I couldn't bear it. We were having lunch. I picked up a knife and threw it at him. Thank goodness I missed him, but that was what was happening at the time. Stalin was shooting them all.
She broke with her first husband over this slur. Later he was purged and killed. She fell in love with and married a second man who still shared her unquestioning adoration for Stalin, but he too was purged. Then, as the wife of an enemy of the people, Ella Shistya was herself arrested and sentenced to prison in Siberia. She was sent with a party of other women crammed into goods wagons. With nothing but salt fish to eat, she developed a desperate thirst.
I remember when there was a hard frost. Inside the wooden cattle truck, I used to lick the ice off the metal screws and bolts, fearing only that my tongue would stick. That's how we traveled, for about a month.
Though their husbands had been killed before they left Moscow, the women were convinced they were in the railway wagon just behind them. As the train went east, they sang a song to their men, hoping they'd hear.
Это мы, ваши жены, подруги, это мы нашу песню поем. Из Москвы по сибирской дороге вместе с вами этапом идем. Прочитали в бутырках нам приговор, дали каждой жене 8 лет и, вручивши конвою пакеты, повезли нас по 100 человек. Было тяжко в холодной теплушке, ели только мы рыбный кондер. У конвоя выпрашивали свечку, не теряя былой свой задор.
Mass shipments of prisoners continued for years. They filled thousands of camps in the remotest and most inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union. Prisoners became an essential part of the workforce, slave labor for the new mines and railways, being forced through regardless.
First I worked on the BAM railway, then in Kolyma. The important thing was not to die of hunger.
Баланду тебе давали, баланда это суп без всякой, ну там
They gave you balanda, a soup with just a few fish bones and some oats floating around. We drank from metal bowls. They gave us a ladle of balanda and a lump of bread.
Вот так вот выпивали его и пайку хлеба. Еле-еле нас заставлял холод работать еще, потому что если
we could hardly work for the cold. If we didn't move or work, we would have frozen.
И когда человек хочет, ну, оправиться за бои, так он должен...
When someone wanted to relieve themselves, they had to take their mittens off. By the time they undid their trousers, their hands were frozen. As soon as they pulled it out, it froze. Many people had their parts amputated.
There
were no injections, anything to reduce pain. They didn't even have proper scalpels. When I was in the camp, they asked me to hold out my frostbitten foot, and with pliers, they just took chunks out. That was the treatment, the operation.
И все лечение, вся операция.
It was considered that if you survived the first winter, you'd get through your sentence. Most people didn't survive.
Большинство не выдерживало.
Stalin's henchmen tried to justify what was happening.
НКВД своей разобщительной работой, раскрытием шпионских организаций не только спас много жизней, которым угрожала опасность от врагов, шпионов, диверсантов, разведчиков.
Applauding the message was the loyal construction worker Tatyana Fyodorova.
А то, что какие-то вот такие политические интриги, игры, которые были, есть и будут, к сожалению.
The fact is that unfortunately you always have political intrigues, machinations of this kind.
Не заслонило движение вперед никак.
It was a very hard time, but it didn't derail the movement forward in any way, because the country was growing at great speed. We're talking about a country of many millions. The whole population worked, sang songs. It doesn't mean that everything was extinguished, everything was lost.
Это не значит, что сразу все куда-то погасло и все пропало. Нет, нет.
The state film studios tried to beguile Soviet audiences into thinking these were normal times, producing escapist musicals to match Hollywood's. On the surface, for those of its people it had not devoured, the great communist experiment could claim to have achieved some of its aims by the end of the 1930s. The vast majority were able to read. Great construction projects like the Moscow Metro had been completed, whatever the cost. And many Soviet citizens had opportunities of work they'd never had before. After her early time as a village teacher, Anastasia Denisova had moved to the city.
The revolution opened my eyes to the world. It gave me everything. I was wearing birch bark sandals when I came to Moscow to study. I didn't reach any great heights after studying, but my eyes were opened.
In 1917, the communists had been a small minority. They'd imposed their idea on their fellow countrymen, hoping to persuade them with the results. But 20 years later, even the early believers knew the promise that the oppressed masses will themselves form the government had not been delivered.
Мы поняли, что это самый главный враг социализма. Значит, мы поняли, что
he was the greatest enemy of socialism.
Этому делу. Тем, что он уничтожил.
He had damaged socialism by destroying people in all parts of life, in agriculture, the arts, the military, and the party. He destroyed people everywhere. Wasn't that evil against those great goals we had in mind?
Злом для той, великой, светлой цели, о которой мы все время говорим.
In the second half of the 1930s alone, over 7 million people were executed, and an estimated 7 million sent to the camps.
There was no socialism of any kind under Stalin. Stalin himself destroyed all socialism. If it hadn't been Stalin, it would have been someone else. Someone would have destroyed this system because, probably, the time had not yet come for such a society.
Для такого общества.
In the camps, ordinary men and women toiled and died as a result of a political system whose rhetoric and utopian promise became one of the most powerful forces affecting the century. And far from dying, the communist system would go on to dominate the lives of many more people after the end of the Second World War, bringing the same popular hopes and the same vicious realities.